Hello, welcome to Mindful. My name is Stan Berman. I'm the Vice President for Academic Affairs here at William James College. Mindful is a series of conversations with the William James College faculty to discuss their scholarship, their research, and their applications within psychology. Today I'm delighted to have an opportunity to talk with my colleague and friend, Dr. Bob Childs.
Hi, Stan.
Hello, hello. As you know, I would like to talk about humanistic psychology.
Yes.
We know that there was a period of intense engagement and excitement beginning in the era I'll arbitrarily name of the 50s to the 70s,
Sure.
where Rogers was remarkably influential, Sidney Girard was writing, Fritz Perls was writing, among others.
Yeah.
Irwin Yalom, and that in more contemporary times, we see that empirically based models have precedence and have the spotlight, and the spotlight is not where it used to be on humanistic psychology.
Right.
I know you have some feelings about that.
Well, it's interesting because in the years that I've been practicing as a therapist and obviously teaching here, I've come to appreciate the tension between the empirically based models and the humanistic models. And it's true that the empirically based models certainly are the dominant model at this point. But to me, the humanistic perspective on psychology is really an important one, and I think is essential to all those who actually practice psychotherapy. So I think the place to start is to think about William James, since this is William James College. And William James, of course, he thought a lot about the nature of what psychology actually is. And he started with a couple principles I think are really central, which is the idea that there's two different types of thinking, what he called directed thinking and fantasy thinking. And the directed thinking is what we would call our rational, logical perspective, or our take on how we think about things. And then, of course, the fantasy thinking is really what he felt was associative thinking, or different ways of looking at things in our rational cognitive minds. And out of this, he came to talk about what I really value and what I try to teach here at William James College, which is the value of noetic experience. And noetic experience for James was all of that kind of intelligence that's outside of our logical, rational cognitions. And when you practice as a psychotherapist, I think this is a really essential component of what humanistic psychologists really value, which is the experience of the process. And so I really enjoy talking to the students here about that and helping them begin to learn as they're practicing in their sites how to really start to attend to their noetic awareness, or that kind of intuitive sensibility, their ability to understand their experience while they're experiencing it. And I think while the empirical models have certainly taken hold, the process variables of psychotherapy still are an essential and important variable in the experience of being a practicing psychotherapist.
Thank you very much. That's a really clear and crisp orientation to the field.
Thank you.
If a graduate student here or at any other graduate program in counseling or psychology came out of a semester with a charismatic cognitive behavioral therapy teacher and came out with ideas about how one thinks about anxiety, for example, or depression, and how one makes an assessment and intervention, when they come to your class, you're going to present a different way to get positioned with that client and work with that client.
Yeah.
How would it shift from what they have just learned the previous year or previous semester?
Yeah. A humanistic psychologist thinks about emotions different than, let's say, a cognitive behavioral therapist or even someone who practices DBT. Because really what we think about is emotions aren't something to be changed or to be gotten rid of or even to be reduced, but really emotions have an intelligence to them that they're trying to convey to the person who is experiencing the emotions. And what we do in humanistic psychology is really help people learn how to stay present to their experience, both as patients and actually as therapists. And we talk a lot about the nature of the psychologist's experience in the room with people on how you can really learn how to use your own experience, including your emotional experience, which really makes it different than a cognitive behavioral model. So we're not interested in sort of having the person really focus on their cognitions or sort of altering their experience in that way. The way we really try to help people is really help them get grounded in their bodies, in their sort of embodied awareness, in their affective experience, and really learn how to have a relationship to themselves in a new way. And Irv Yalom, of course, had a great way of talking about that. He would say that, you know, the humanistic approach or the existential approach is really about experience and the examination of that experience. And so what we try to do in the humanistic courses that I teach here is really learn how to examine one's experience and to translate it, which one of my great mentors was Les Havens, who was a wonderful psychiatrist here in Boston for many years. And Les was really a great believer in the act of translation of experience. So you don't lose the essence of the experience, but rather you get to an awareness of it, not necessarily through a cognitive awareness, but through a felt awareness.
Thank you. So you've mentioned Yalom and you've mentioned Havens. When you think about your heroes in this field, who else is in that list? Certainly
Carl Jung was a real sort of central person to humanistic psychology. You know, Maslow, of course, was one of the great originators of this school of thought. And Maslow really ended up moving into what he ended up calling more transpersonal psychology in his later years. And Carl Jung, of course, was one of the great transpersonal psychologists. And by that I mean someone who believes that there is sort of an aspect of ourselves that is outside of our awareness that can really help inform our experience. And for Jung, it really came through his understanding and work with dreams, not so much in a psychoanalytic way of reducing dreams to a particular meaning, but rather understanding that the nature of the imagination itself is incredibly valuable. And here we're linking back to James, of course, who knew Jung, and they influenced each other. But the idea that there's an intelligence to our psyches, or to what Jung and Maslow would call our big S self, that is that awareness that's outside of our egoic experience. So Jung was a huge influence on me. And I think really over the years, Winnicott is another person in the humanistic camp who I really came to appreciate, because Winnicott talks a lot about the nature of play. You know, obviously he went from being a pediatrician to working with children, and really came to value the verbal experience is important, but really what was primary to Winnicott was the value of the process. And so even you know, in today's world, if you're being trained as a cognitive behavioral or a DBT therapist, that's really focused more on sort of a technique. But the humanistic model is really, because it's so focused on the process, really believes in the value of the interaction itself. And Winnicott really valued the whole aspect of play. Not that the verbal is not important, but the experience itself is more important. And one of the great sayings that I like to tell my students about is, we talk in psychology a lot about resistance. And in many schools of thought, resistance is thought of in terms of being inside of the patient, and it's the resistance to change. But Winnicott said that resistance is actually in the therapist. And it's the therapist's inability to play and to engage in that third space, that interactive space with the patient. And that is really how to bring the work to life.
Wonderful. I am a very huge fan of Winnicott, but that particular idea is new to me.
Yeah.
And a lovely one.
I really think it's a great perspective to take into your work.
Yes. So a moment ago you talked about experience outside of the ego.
Yes.
And it made me think of the following. In our field's push to be a science, there was a very tall wall built around spirituality and the spiritual experience of human beings.
Right.
And I think that wall is deconstructed in a humanistic approach. Could you talk a bit about that?
For me, If I was to think about a mindfulness aspect, what I like to talk about is something I call a synthetic awareness that students become aware of. So if you practice meditation, what you learn is how to really, say, attend to your breath and really attend to your experience of that, and you become mindful of that. And as you do that, you develop a capacity to really observe your experience. And it's my belief that when you practice as a psychologist and you're practicing therapy, that this kind of synthetic awareness, which really comes out of Piaget and his idea of the synthetic function, this synthetic awareness is your ability to be in your experience and observing it at the same time. And this kind of being open to experience that you learn through meditation, for example, it becomes a really essential component of actually the practice of psychology. As you're sort of becoming, and again we'll reference James because he was such a believer in this, about the margins of your experience, that there's different kinds of awareness that are outside of your sort of egoic awareness. And that has a spiritual component, because to be informed by that, to be open to that information, that noetic information, really becomes a key component of the therapist's experience of the work in terms of what's coming into the work. I joke about this, and this is a reflection on Pythagoras, but Pythagoras had a great expression for what marriage is, which he said that in marriage it's 1 and 1 equals 3. And by that he meant the third element. And so in psychodynamic or psychoanalytic thinking, that's thought of as intersubjective experience. But in the humanistic model, it's really thought in more of a spiritual sense, that there's an intelligence or an awareness that informs the work, this third element that comes into the work. And by developing this kind of mindful awareness or synthetic awareness, you can actually translate that experience back into the room. And that may come through a felt experience in your body. It may come through a memory of what's being spoken. It may come through just a linking of some kind. And that part deepens the process. And it's certainly spiritually, from a humanistic perspective, it's spiritually informed because it's outside of our sort of conscious awareness of ourselves.
It's a very helpful answer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
You've talked about humanistic psychology, you've talked about existential psychology. Are you using them synonymously? Is there a distinction?
Existential mode is really about this immediacy, that being in the present moment, and really learning how to sort of stay with the here and now. Alum, who we had in our humanistic lecture series here at William James, he talked a lot about that, about really learning how to help people stay in the here and now, both not only the patient, but obviously the psychologist as well. And so the existential has profound impact on the humanistic model, and I think they're in a sort of a symbiotic relationship.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Your students certainly are being trained in an era where the scientific and data are preeminent.
Yes.
And they're coming into your seminar, and they're being exposed to ideas that perhaps are relatively new to them.
Yeah.
What kind of response do you get from your students?
My sense is it's a very positive one. I think they're very interested, and for many of them, it's really the first time that they've started to think about how they can use their own experience in their work with patients. But I also feel like there's an awakening to really, not just in terms of the history of psychology, which is obviously important in terms of, as you're practicing even in the age of empiricism today, right? But it's also that there's more to psychology than you were just thinking about, whether you're sort of practicing from a sort of a perspective of a manualized treatment or a behavioral model of some sort, that maybe there's more to the experience than meets the eye. And I think there's often an awakening in my classes where people really get engaged, mm-hmm. and they really start to think about their experience. What I really try to do is link it not just to their personal experience, because I believe in teaching all the theories through the autobiographies of all the theorists in humanistic psychology. I think there's an immense way it's a great way to teach, understanding how somebody is a meaning maker in their own lives and how that can translate into theory, which obviously for any student becomes really important because each person comes with their own story and their own reasons that are leading them to pursue psychology. And so the idea of each person being a theory maker is, I think, a really important one. We learn as psychologists how hard it is to really help people. And I think that we really want to learn how to not just sort of treat them with sort of protocols and with manualized approaches, but really how to think in the moment with people and how to be comfortable and develop confidence in your ability to really stay connected to yourself. And my training was at Cambridge Hospital, and I worked with really profoundly disturbed and struggling people, and I think you really learn how to stay connected to yourself in order to be able to do really good work with people. And I think the humanistic model really helps people learn those really essential elements into, to me, to what's required to be a really good clinical psychologist.
Wonderful. And you anticipated my second question, which is why the humanistic perspective and values are so important today. And I think you've responded nicely to that.
Yeah, thank you. It's something I'm passionate about, as you know, and I really believe that there's an essential role for the humanistic model in today's world. And, you know, I think ultimately over time, you know, the pendulum will come back towards the humanistic models. And, you know, it'll be different, of course, but I think there can be a mutual influence between the empirical models and the humanistic and existential models.
Terrific. A couple concluding questions.
Yes.
One is about, is there someone writing right now that has caught your eye and is an exciting new leader in this area?
You know, I was thinking another person that we had here at the William James College was Stanley Berman, who has written a lot of very interesting things about trauma and dreams, you know, and I think, again, the humanistic model has great relevance for working with PTSD and trauma. So Krippner's, you know, he's getting up there in years now, but he was great to have here. I think, you know, Robbie Bosnak is a mentor of mine who's writing today, who's, I think, a terrific writer, and he was trained in Zurich at the Jung Institute, but he's an original thinker. And I think, you know, one of the things that Jung said that I've always valued is that he would never be a Jungian. In other words, he's not interested in sort of copying someone else's model of working. But it's important to know, of course, but ultimately you really want to become yourself. And I think seeing Robbie Bosnak, his work is very good. He does a lot of work with what's called embodied imagination and how to really use the imagination as a sort of a living entity, as a real tool. And that is really central to what I teach, which is the role of images and symbolic experience at conveying parts of people's experience that doesn't necessarily have language, but it becomes an essential part of therapy. And Robbie was a great influence on me.
Terrific, and thank you. A new name to me.
Great.
So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So as we're wrapping up, I thank you, and I'm wondering if you have a final reflection.
Well, it's just that I have had a great experience teaching here at William James College. I feel like it's a great sort of laboratory to engage with people, and I find it that it's really a great place to explore what it really means to be a psychologist, to sort of go, I like to talk to my students about going off-road. You know, there's the major highways that you can go down, but you have to learn to be comfortable going off-road. And to do that, I think you have to really be comfortable with yourself. And so I appreciate the opportunity to teach at this school, and I really appreciate the students who come here and really become open to learning.
Wonderful. Dr. Bob Childs, thank you very much.
Thank you, Stan. I really appreciate it.